Hey coders, welcome to another exciting video on my channel. In this video, we are going to see a variation of pagination logic. So previously, we have already covered basic pagination with PHP, of course. In this video, we are going to learn its another variation, which is very popular with e-commerce websites, such as this one. So as you can see, when you load this page, you see certain products. When you go down, you see a button which says load more products or something similar. When you click on it, some more products get loaded. And this is a SPA based application. That means the whole page doesn't get reloaded. Only new products get appended into this page. So again, if you have more products, you will see this button. If you click on it, you will see even more products without the whole page being reloaded. So this is the logic of pagination, a variation of pagination which we are going to implement today. Now, because these cards contain images, that means it's going to require more logic to incorporate images. And our aim is to learn the basic concept of this kind of load more pagination. So we are going to implement this type of page where you have same cards, but we don't have any image to display, because image requires a little bit more coding logic, which has nothing to do with the concept of implementing this load more type of pagination. So if you click on this load more, you will see some more properties will be appended to the page, and you have to pay attention over here as well, because you will notice the page does not get reloaded. So you see some more properties got appended, but our page did not reload, and the URL remains the same as well. So again, some more properties got appended, no reloading of the page, and the URL is still the same. So this is the logic that we are going to implement. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the project that we are going to implement. In this project, currently we have 3 files. All of them are empty. So this is index.php, this is script.js, and this is style.css. For CSS, I have already put in all these styles that we need to define for this project, because again, the aim is not to distract you with the CSS, rather to pay our whole attention on the logic of load more pagination, SPA style pagination, for which we are going to implement Ajax concepts, and we will be using Fetch API to implement this Ajax concepts. So Ajax simply is a concept through which you can interact with the backend asynchronously, that is in the background, without interfering what you see in the browser. If these terms asynchronous, Ajax or Fetch API, if they are new to you, don't worry, I will explain everything to you once we get there. Okay, so our style.css is already complete. Let's close this. Now let's start with the index.js file. In this file, we are going to implement both the PHP as well as the HTML logic. So we are going to start with the starting and closing PHP tags over here. Sorry, this is script.js. Let's go to index.php. So within this tag, we will define the PHP logic, and we also need our HTML. So let's generate the boilerplate code. Now over here, let's link our style and CSS files. So this is our style file. We don't need to make any changes over here. Now for the script file, let's come to the very end of the body and script.source and script.js. We can attach this defer keyword if we want to ensure that this script.js file is loaded once all the contents have already been loaded into the DOM. Okay, so now what we need is, when the page is first loaded, we see certain properties. So on this page, we have a heading. So let's start with heading. So let's start with this heading. Available properties. Let's define a div which is going to contain all of these properties, and outside this div we will have a button for this load more. So for this, we are going to define both its ID as well as its class name. So for the ID, we have to start with hash property container. That's the name that I'm going to assign to this div, the ID. And for the class name, grid container. So now we have a div with the ID property container and a class grid container. And within this div, we are going to dynamically incorporate all of these properties. So we will be doing this incorporation through PHP. Therefore, let's leave it empty for the time being and come down and define the load more button. So button with the ID load-more. For the caption, load more. That's it. Let's open it in the browser. So this is how it currently looks. We have this h1 and an empty div, and then this load more button. So that means our CSS styles are taking effect. Okay. Now let's go up and define the logic which will request this data from the backend, from the database, and incorporate it into the page. So what we are going to do is that we are going to start off with connectivity with the database. Let's define a connection variable, connection object basically, which is going to contain an object of type MySQL. Now this takes 4 parameters. The first one is where our database is. So it's on localhost. So localhost, then in order to get access to this database, we need username and password. So on my system, the username is root, password is empty. Now on this database system, we need to define the exact database through which we want to communicate. So we want to communicate a database named realestate_db. Let me show you this database. I have defined this database for another project for real estate businesses, a full stack web application. If you are interested, you can check out that playlist as well. Okay, so this is the database realestate_db. And this one has 2 tables. We are interested in this property table. We will be using its property ID column, property name, city, and do we have another one? So property ID, name, city, yeah, that's it. So these are the fields that we will be using for the project. Now we really have to make sure that we have actually got a connection by using if and checking its connectivity. But let's ignore this part as well, again, because we focus on the pagination logic. So we are assuming that this will connect to our database successfully every time. Now next, what we are going to do is that we are going to define the SQL query, and then we will see if there are certain pieces of information that are missing from that query that we need to provide to this query. And then we will think about where to get those pieces of information and provide it to the query. So the query we are going to define with this variable name SQL. Select. So the names are property ID, property name, and city from the table named property. So this is a basic SQL select statement. Now we have to define the pagination aspect. So for the pagination, we need to define 2 elements. The first one is with each HTTP request, you have to let the server know that out of all the rows in the table, so these are all the rows in the table, how many of those rows to return. So this is one piece of information. So basically we have to define the size of the chunk. Let's say if we define the size of the chunk to be 4, so these are the 4 pieces of rows which are supposed to be returned in the first request. Then in the second request, the next 4 rows, and in the third request, the next 4 rows, and likewise. So the first piece of information is the number of rows returned with each HTTP request. The second part is once that chunk is decided, now you have to define which of those 4 rows need to be returned with each request. So if we don't define that second piece of information, every time we will be returned these 4 rows because the default value is going to be considered and the default value is going to be 0. So every time 0 rows will be skipped and next 4 rows will be returned. So if we want the rows to keep changing with each HTTP request, we have to keep updating the second piece of information. That is, how many rows should be skipped before returning the next 4 rows. So that part is the second one. So let's define both of these parts. So we have to define the limit, which will basically define the chunk, the size of the chunk, which will be returned with each HTTP request. So for that, we have to have, let's make it 6. Let's make it constant. Or let's define a variable. Limit, let's give it value 6, and over here place in that value variable. So this is the chunk size. Now we have to define how many rows to be skipped every time the request is made to the database. For that we have to use the keyword offset, and we should have defined a variable named offset as well. So this is how it currently looks. Select property ID, property name, city from property table, limit the chunk, and this is the offset. Now the question is, where do we get this offset variable from? So we don't know where this variable is, because if you notice, we don't have any query parameters over here. So even if we keep asking for more and more products or properties in our case, because there is no query parameter, so we cannot extract it from the URL. If we had the query parameter, like for the basic pagination that we covered in another video, then we could easily extract it from the query parameter and assign it to the offset. But in our case, we don't have this luxury anymore. So we have to figure out where can we get this information from. So let's comment this out for the time being. Now this is an extra piece of information. If you don't want to do this, we can ignore it. But if you notice, these properties are all in ascending order. So starting with property ID 47, 46, 45, they are all in the, descending order. They are starting with the highest property ID and they keep decreasing. So if this is a sorting order, we want our properties to be returned from the backend. We can define this logic in this select statement as well. So before the limit, after describing the table name, we can say order by property ID And if we don't define anything, they will be ordered in the ascending order. That is, the smallest ID property will come first and the property with the largest ID will come at the end. But since we want to reverse the order, so we have to mention it with this descending keyword. Okay, so this is our total SQL statement. Now let's execute this query. So we will get a result set once we execute this query. We have to call this connection object, and its particular method that we are interested in is query. And we have to pass in this SQL statement. Okay. Now, obviously, if we execute the program right now, we will run into error because we don't have this offset variable defined that we are using over here. But obviously, we are not going to execute this program until we figure out where to get the value for this offset variable. Anyway, so we have to assume we have this offset variable defined and we have successfully executed the query. So once we execute the query, this result variable is going to contain the result set. So now we are ready to display it over here in this div. So now we have basically 6 rows in this result variable that we are going to display in this div as a card. So this card. Okay, so now over here we have to define each card. So we already have this div. Now let's define one card manually and then we will see how can we replicate it. Okay, so if we had just one card, how would we go about it? So we will define another div with the class name property-card. So this div will contain or represent one card. Then next thing, over here we are supposed to have some image, but in order to simplify things, we are not bringing in any image, but we are defining a div which is supposed to contain that image. So let's define property-image as a div. So this div is supposed to contain the image of the property. But since we don't have any div, we have this text property, then this hash sign and the number, the ID. So property, then hash symbol, and then we need to get this property ID from this result set. So since we don't have anything at the moment, just put in this ID keyword, the ID text. Then let's define another div, property-info class name. And this is going to contain this text. So we are going to put in this text as h3 and this one is a paragraph in this div. So h3 and it's going to contain, let's put in the text, the static text for the time being, property name, and for the paragraph, the city. Then we need another div for this ID. So property-ID is the class name. Now it contains ID, space, and then we need the ID. Of course, we have to replace or we have to make this part dynamic. This thing is going to be dynamic. The city is also going to be dynamic and this part is also going to be dynamic. But currently we are just focusing on defining a card. So everything is static for the time being. Let's refresh. Undefined variable offset. Okay. So what we are going to do is that let's uncomment it and give it some offset value. In the beginning, we want first 4 rows, so we want to skip 0 rows. Okay, so now we have this property with ID, then property name, city, and the ID. So this is the structure of the card. Now we have to make it dynamic. So now what we are going to do is that again, since we have all the rows in this result variable, so now let's come down over here, and again within this, the div, in the property container div, we are going to iterate over all of those results. So basically what we are going to do is that we are going to comment this part out because this part represents one card. Okay. So what we are going to do is that we are going to define a function in the PHP part over here. Render properties. And we are going to pass in all the properties. So this render properties function is supposed to return this card for each of the properties. Okay, so what we are going to do over here is that within the body of this div, we are simply going to echo out this, whatever is returned by this function. So render properties, we are going to pass in that result set. This is the short form for opening PHP tag along with the echo keyword. Okay. This render function is supposed to return all the properties as a card to display. Okay, so what we are going to do is that we are going to define this render function. So we need this part. So Control X. So basically in this property container, we only have this function. We are calling this function render properties. Now let's go up and define this function. Now, since we know that this render property, the parameter that we pass to this render properties is supposed to contain the result set, so we are going to iterate over this result set. Let's define a variable named HTML and give it empty text. Then iterate over while loop. While each row, we are iterating over one row at a time from the properties fetch a sock. Because we know these properties will be actually this result set, so we are iterating over these properties. So each row gets converted into associative array and stored in this row variable. We are going to extract these parameters into local variables. So id equals row property id. Let's copy paste it 2 more times, change the variable name to name, and for the second one let's change it to city. Then this one is going to be property name and this one is going to be city. Now this ID is usually auto-generated in the database, so this is pretty much a safe data. However, this one we can enclose it into parentheses and pass it as a parameter to HTML special characters to clean the data and sanitize it. Again, this is not necessary for our project, but let's do it anyway. Okay, so now we have variables ID, name and city. Now we have to bring in this div. So we have to basically insert this div, echo out this whole div. Now since this is mostly HTML with this a placeholder where we are supposed to insert the PHP data. Likewise over here we are supposed to insert PHP data, and over here we are supposed to insert PHP data as well as over here. Other than that, the rest is HTML. So if we use HTML concatenation, we will have to use HTML, convert this part into text, concatenate into this variable, and then again concatenate it with this text. So it's going to be messy. What we are going to do is that we are going to use PHP's multi-line string interpolation. So basically we can have a text which is on multi-line, and because of a string interpolation, we can place in the variable names as well without the confusion of these starting quotation and ending quotation, then dot for the concatenation, then again another part, then dot for the concatenation, and so on. So it gets messy. So instead what we are going to do is that we are going to say you are using this HTML and we want to concatenate it with everything over here. So if we are using here doc, we have to use 3 angle brackets and then the name. So these 3 curly brackets are supposed to be followed by some identifier. Now it can be any identifier, but since we are going to incorporate HTML elements mostly, so we are going to use this HTML. And now let's uncomment this part and uncomment this part as well. So this whole thing is part of HTML doc. And over here we have to close this here doc, so we have to use the same identifier that we used over here. So the beginning tag starts with 3 angle brackets followed by, without any space, HTML or any identifier name. So now this whole thing is a string without putting it into quotations. So this whole thing is a string, and over here we can also define the variables. So the ID, so this is the PHP ID or variable name that we have inserted. Likewise over here we are going to put in the name, and over here city. So this is the start. This indicates the start of here doc string or multi-line string in which you can incorporate PHP variables as well. But you also need to indicate that where does this string ends. So for that you have to repeat the name or the identifier that you mentioned over here at the end as well. So this is the beginning of the string and this is the end of the string. And within this string we have mostly HTML except for these variables. So these are PHP variables. If you don't use here doc, you will have to use this thing, like put it inside the quotation marks. Then you have to use concatenation, and then another part, you can put this whole thing up to this part, you can put it inside the quotations. Now because, then concatenate, and then this is PHP, and then again this is concatenate. So it's going to get very messy. So instead, you can go with here docs. Okay, so now we have this HTML which contains this whole div. Now all we need to do is return that HTML variable, this one. So we need to define this HTML, give it some initial value, empty string. So this HTML is supposed to come outside these brackets. So now this HTML will contain 3 of these concatenated together, and then those 6 divs concatenated together, and then we are returning those divs which are actually cards at the end. So this is the logic of the render properties function, and over here we are defining it. So this is our project. Let's refresh. Okay, we only have one, so we are obviously making some kind of mistake. Okay, what is happening? We have already defined this HTML with the empty string. So, but accidentally we also defined this within the while loop. So what happened every time? The whole HTML got erased with every iteration of while loop. So let's delete this. Refresh, and now we have 6 properties: 47, 46, 45, 44, 43, 42. Now if we click on this load more, nothing will happen because we haven't yet defined the logic. So now we are ready to get working on that. Now the logic for this load more buttons needs to be such that when we click on this button, we not only get the properties, but this URL should not change, and neither should this page get reloaded. If none of these two things are supposed to happen, that means we cannot take advantage of query string. Like in the previous pagination tutorial, this one. Now if you notice, when you click on page 2, not only the page will be reloaded, but you will see the query string attached over here. So if you notice, the page got reloaded and we saw the query string attached over here as well. So we were taking advantage of this part in order to figure out the offset value. This page number was eventually giving us the offset value. But if we are supposed to keep this same, we are not supposed to change the URL, and neither are we changed to attach a query string. Likewise, we are not supposed to reload the page. Then how are we going to do that? Well, for that we are going to utilize Ajax concept. Well, Ajax is a concept which means you are going to interact with your backend without changing or reloading this page. Therefore, it has to be behind the scenes and asynchronous. The reason that it has to be behind the scenes is because we want to get the data, but we don't want to change this page over here. We don't want to reload the page, and it has to be asynchronous so that while a request to bring in or fetch in more data is already been sent to the server, in the meantime, you can buy these products or add it to your cart or view these properties or whatever the other tasks that the website allows you to do with these cards, you can do them. So it has to be that. So for that, we have Ajax concept. Ajax is a concept for which there are different technologies through which you can implement that concept. So it's asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. Well, XML is not going to be utilized in this tutorial. So it's usually requesting or sending a HTTP request to the server to bring back data without changing anything on the browser. So that's called asynchronous JavaScript. So JavaScript provides different APIs by default. So basically not JavaScript, it's the browser. The browser provides different APIs using which we can implement this asynchronous or Ajax concept. One of those APIs that could be utilized for implementing this Ajax concept is XML HTTP request. So this is the name of the API. It contains different methods through which we can make asynchronous requests behind the scenes to the backend, get the response, and without reloading the page in the browser, we can incorporate new data by manipulating the DOM. So this is XML HTTP request. It's still widely used, but it's slightly complicated, so it's used for complicated tasks. But for simpler tasks, such as the one that we are going to do today, we are going to use another API, again by default available by the browser, and that API is Fetch API. So Fetch API is simpler and easier to understand, and for simpler tasks, Fetch API is more commonly used. So we are using the Fetch API. When we click on this button, using this Fetch API, a request will be sent to the server to ask for more data. And because we can't attach a query string over here, in the request that we are going to make through the Fetch API, we will somehow add that additional information in that request so that the server can figure out what should be the offset value. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so since we are going to make this request through JavaScript, so let's go to the script.js file. And we have to define logic over here, but the logic is going to depend on this value limit. So somehow we have to let the JavaScript know that the value of the limit is 6. For that, what we are going to do is that let's define another script tag. And what we are going to do is that we are going to attach to this window object this property limit. And to this, we are going to assign PHP limit value. So since the variable is PHP variable, therefore we have to enclose it within these starting and closing PHP tags. And the variable is limit. Now this script.js file has access to this window object or limit property through this window object. So let's go to the script.js file. And the first thing that we have to do over here is we have to get a reference to both the load button and the div which contains the cards. So this button has a ID load-more, and this div has a ID property-container. So let's get references to both of them. So const container document dot query selector. Now because we are accessing a ID, so hash, and the button was load -more. Sorry, we are okay. Property container, because I've already given the name container. So property container. Now copy paste it. Change the name from container to load button, and the ID is load more. Okay, so now let's create two more variables. One is going to be offset, and the initial value of offset is just missing. The initial value of offset is going to be the same as the limit. So we know that limit is going to come from window.limit object. So what we are going to do, okay, window.limit, and in order to just shorten this window.limit, otherwise each time we will have to write this whole window.limit. So we are in order to shorten it, we are going to create this limit variable, or shall we make it constant? Because limit will never change. So window.limit. So now we have four variables. Two are references to DOM elements. The other ones are one variable, one constant. The constant limit is whatever limit you get from your PHP or window.limit object, and the initial value of offset is exactly the same as limit. The reason we are giving initial offset value to be 6 is because we already have this data. So the very first request that we make through this load more button is going to have offset 6, so that the first 6 properties gets skipped. Otherwise we will have a repeat of these properties. We don't want repeat of these properties, so it makes sense to give the initial value offset to be the same as limit. Okay. Now we have to define an event listener. Click event listener for this load button. So load button dot add event listener. The event is going to be click, and as a callback, let's define arrow function. Now we are going to utilize the Fetch API. So if you are not familiar with this Fetch API, it's a promise-based API. So basically, whenever you call this function, it returns a promise. I'm not going to get into the details of what the promise is, but if you are not familiar with it, you can think of promise as not containing the actual value, rather a promise that very soon, we don't know when, but eventually some data will be returned through that promise. But because this is an asynchronous request, that means in the meantime, you can define the logic that once the data is actually been received, that is, the promise has been fulfilled, then you can already define the logic which will define what to do with that data once the data is received. So that's the general idea behind a promise. Now this fetch takes two parameters. The first one is going to be the endpoint where this request is supposed to go, and the second one is going to contain the rest of the information that you are going to incorporate into the HTTP request, such as if you want to send the data along with that HTTP request, you can attach through second parameter, and if you have some headers that you want to set, you are again going to set those headers through the second parameter. The first part is always an endpoint. Now this endpoint can be a URL, but over here we are going to use this index.php because the sender of the request and the receiver or the handler of this request are both going to be the same file, that is index.php. So let's use backtick and index.php. Now because this is a URL, so we can attach a query string to it. So it's question mark. Then we can send the current value of offset, which is $, and we are going to use this offset variable. Okay, because we use backtick, that means now it's a string interpolation, and within the string interpolation, we can incorporate variable names or variables along with the text, along with the string. So this is the URL. Again, this is a relative URL because this part is going to remain the same. So the endpoint that we are going to define is going to get attached over here. Okay, so the file name is index.php and we are attaching a query string named offset, and this is the current value of offset, which is 6. Okay, now this is the URL, the endpoint. Now through second parameter, we have to set different properties that we want to attach to HTTP request. Now since there are going to be different properties, so it's an object. The second parameter that we are passing to this fetch is going to be an object. So for that, the first thing that we have to let the PHP file know that this is the second request. So when we load the page for the very first time, this is normal rendering. But when we click on this load more button and a request is sent to the same index.php file, the index.php file has to figure out somehow that this is not the very first time that the page is going to be loaded into the browser. Rather, the page is already there in the browser. So this time we have to send a portion of the string which will be appended to this current page. So that means the index.php file has to be able to figure out if the request has come for the very first time by typing in the URL in the browser or through clicking this load more button. So for that, we are going to define custom headers. Now I'm sure with any HTTP request, some headers are always by default set, and each HTTP request contain those headers even when we don't define them. So they have default values. But now we are going to define a custom header because we want to let the index.php file know that this is not a normal request, rather it has been sent by clicking on load more button. That means we already have some data and now you only have to send some more data. So initially when the page was loaded, this whole document was kind of returned. But this time when the load more button is clicked, we don't want this whole document to be returned, because if we do that, the page will reload in the browser. So we have to somehow let the PHP know that you don't have to send the whole HTML file, rather just a portion that we will append in that existing HTML file or currently displayed file in the browser. Okay, so again, this header is going to be an object. Sorry, it's S headers and it's an object. We are going to define a custom header. Now it's not necessary, but a little while back, it was a convention to attach X followed by hyphen, not underscore, hyphen, to any custom headers. So any headers which are not standard headers that are sent along with any HTTP request are custom headers. And in order to identify those custom headers, you have to attach this capital X followed by hyphen so that there is no confusion between a standard header and a custom header. And this way we can define the same name for the custom header as one of the standard headers, because now we have this part to distinguish between them. Nowadays, it's not necessary, but this convention is still followed. So if you are defining any custom header, you usually by convention will attach this part to any header, any custom header. So now the name of the header is going to be, again, it's a convention. You can give any name, but requested with. So we have to enclose it within the quotations because it's just a string. Okay, so this is requested with X hyphen requested hyphen with. That means this HTTP request is being requested with some information. And what that information is, so we are sending XML HTTP request. So this is one of the APIs that is by default available by the browser. Even though we are not using this API, but this new Fetch API is practically doing the same job that this API is supposed to do. And because this is an oldest API, so even older browsers knows about it. So we are using this name. Again, this is a convention. You can give any names over here, A, B, C, and something, anything. You can do anything you like. But giving this value and this name is the convention. So we are following the convention. Okay. So anyways, we are sending a custom header with this request. So when an HTTP request is received by index.php, and if it contains this header, that means this request has come through the fetch request or by clicking the load more button. And if the HTTP request comes without this header, that means this request has come by typing the URL in the address bar. So this is the headers part. So through this, basically, you are going to identify Ajax request. Now we don't have any data to send along with this fetch request, so we are not adding anything further to this fetch request. Okay, so this is the starting parenthesis and this is the closing parenthesis. Now we know this fetch request does not immediately gives us result or data, rather it gives us a promise. So in order to capture the promise, we have to use the then clause. Now you can imagine this then clause to be when the fetch request successfully returns you the result, then what you want to do with it should be defined over here. So this is what the then clause is. And for some reason, if this promise cannot be fulfilled, that means an error has occurred. In that case, we have another clause, which is called catch clause. So if something goes wrong and fetch fails to fulfill its promise, then the next step we define over here. Okay, so, but in both the cases, those steps, whatever you define over here are defined through callback function. So both of them take callback function as parameters. So as far as the catch is concerned, it's very simple. We are going to, using the arrow function, we are going to pass the error to this arrow function, and we can simply say console.error and pass this error. So this error is a function. Sorry, it's complete error, ERROR. Now when it's as simple as this one, you can straight away say console.error. It's the same thing. You can simply write it like that. So this is a function or method defined with the console object, and to which whatever is passed through this catch block will be passed as a parameter to this error method. Now let's move on to the then case. So then block. If the promise has been fulfilled and we have been returned a HTTP request, HTTP response, then again we have to define logic using the arrow function. So the response that we will receive, we are passing it as a parameter to the arrow function, and that HTTP response will be a whole object. From there we have to extract and process the response, the data portion. So the object that we receive is going to be HTTP response. Now this HTTP response is going to have many things, including headers and other stuff besides data, whereas we are just interested in data. So what we need to do is that we have to do the processing and parsing. Only then we will be able to extract the data. Now this extracting and parsing is going to take time, so we want to make it asynchronous as well. So what we are going to do is that on this response object we are going to call response.text method. That is, we only want to extract the data portion, the text portion from HTTP request. The HTTP response. Now remember, the HTTP response also contains other additional information such as headers. We are not interested in them. We are only interested in the response portion, the payload part. So we are calling this text method on that response because we are being returned the text. This thing. So this thing will be returned. So this is HTML is a text. This whole thing is a text. Therefore, we are using this response dot calling this text method on response. Now this text method, again, because it's going to take a while to extract the payload and then parse it, so we want it to be done through asynchronously as well. Therefore, this method also returns us a promise. That means in order to capture that data, we have to use another then block. So this then block will receive the whole HTTP response. From there, we are extracting the data, and when that data will be made available, it's going to be captured by this then block. And over here, we will just receive the text. It will not be an object. We will not need to do any kind of extraction and parsing. It will only be the part we are already interested in. So now, again, we are going to use a callback function, so arrow function. The parameter that we are going to pass or capture the data received by this one is given the name HTML. Again, it's up to us, no hard and fast rule. But over here, we have to do a bit of processing, so curly brackets. So now we have to check if we have actually been given a data or not. Remember, if we keep on clicking this load button, eventually all the properties have already been displayed on the page and the backend does not have any more properties to return us. In that case, the HTML element will be empty. So we want to check if this is empty or not. So if html.trim, after trimming the HTML, if this is equal to an empty text, then we want to set this load button.disable to be true. Control X, bring in the curly brackets, paste back. So disable the load button and change the caption from this load more to no more properties. So load button dot inner text equals no more properties. If that is not the case, then we want to access the container and we want to append the text at the very bottom. So when you want to append whatever you have received to the very end of any HTML or DOM element, you have a DOM method called insert adjacent HTML. This takes two parameters. First one is the position, the insertion position, and the second one, the actual text that you want to insert or the elements that you want to insert. So we want to insert so we want the insertion position to be right at the end. So where our div ends, so right before that end. So the name of that position is before end. That inserted before the end of the current DOM element, which is this container. And what do we want to be inserted? That's HTML element, the text that we have received. And now since we have made one request, so now we have to change the value of this offset so that next time when we make the request, the offset value has changed from 6 to something else. So initially it's 6. Now after we make the first request, we want the offset value to change from the current value of offset plus limit. So initial value is 6 and limit is 6. So 6 plus 6, 12. That means with the next HTTP request, the offset value will be 12. That means the first 12 rows will be skipped and next 6 rows will be given. And when we make the third request, 12 plus 6 will become 18. So 18 rows will be skipped and next 6 rows will be returned. So this is the logic as far as the JavaScript is concerned. Now we have to go to index.php and we have to let this index.php know how to make this index.php file distinguish between the request, if the request has come from this URL over here by hitting this address bar or by clicking this load more button. So what we can do is that we know the request that will come will either contain this header or it will not contain the header. So we want in the PHP file to look for this header. If this header is present, then don't send this whole HTML. Don't send it. Rather, just return this part. And if it's not the case, if that header is not present, then send this whole HTML body, sorry, the whole HTML document. Okay, so for that, what we are going to do is that, so this was while, okay, let's come down and at the end of the definition of this render function, render properties function. So basically, before the closing tag, what we are going to do is check if this is Ajax request by detecting the presence or absence of Ajax request with error. So we can check if this is an Ajax request by detecting this. Plus we can also do and by also detecting the query param only present with fetch API request. So if you notice, so when we are requesting through fetch API, we are also attaching a query parameter. So we have basically two ways through which we can ensure if this is an Ajax request or a normal request. Okay, so what we can do is, let's create a variable is Ajax. And we are going to check if its set is set, $_get, the query parameter name is offset. If this is present, and now we have to say if this header is present. Now the headers that we send to HTTP, their names change slightly. So the first thing that happens is every hyphen gets turned into underscore and every header gets prepended with HTTP underscore as well. And they get turned into capital as well. So this requested has just R capital, it will turn into capital, whole word will turn into capital. Likewise, this width will also turn into capital. So three things happens. All hyphens turned into underscores, everything gets capitalized, and every header gets prepended with HTTP underscore keyword as well. So if this is the keyword or header that we are looking for, then over here we have to say not empty, which header, HTTP, all capital underscore, then X underscore, then requested underscore with. So if this header is not empty, that means it's present. Now we have to check if it has this value as well. Which one? Where is it? In the script.js file. If this is the value of this header. So another and. In order to simplify, let's use string to lower. So before making the comparison, convert it into a lowercase. Okay, there is one more thing I forgot. So this header is going to be stored in a global variable, which is $underscore server. So paste it over here. So we have to get this header from this server global variable. So now string to lower, we have to convert this whole thing into lowercase, copy, paste it. So after converting it into lowercase, you have to check if it's equal to XML HTTP request. If all three conditions are satisfied, let me decrease the font size a bit more. Okay, so we have to check if this offset is set. Then we have to check if this header is present. And then we have to check if it's okay, it's present, but is its value equal to this value? If all three are satisfied, all three conditions are satisfied, that means it is an Ajax request. In that case, what you are going to do is that you are going to say if is Ajax. In that case, echo, call the function render properties and pass in the result variable. This contains the result set, and then exit the program. So if you exit it right here, you will never come to this part. So if you are making the request through Ajax, then simply execute or call this function, whatever is returned by this function, just echo it. And echo means just display it in the browser. Because the request has been made through the Fetch API, so this echo will actually be just a text in the HTTP response to this function over here. So it will get there, and now through JavaScript, that text will be appended in the DOM. However, if that is not the case, then this part will not execute, and our program will not terminate at this exit, and it will come down over here and execute this part. So I hope we have not made any mistake, and I hope you have understood the logic. Let's go and verify the logic in the browser. Let's refresh. Okay, definitely we have done something. The problem is over here with this if statement. So both of these statements are supposed to execute if the request is Ajax. Otherwise, what will happen, even though this statement will not execute when the request is made through Ajax, but exit will execute in every case. And since our HTML comes after this exit, so even when we are making the first request, by typing in the URL over here, because of this exit, it never reaches this part. That's why you couldn't see anything there. Since it was not through Ajax, so there was nothing to display. And because it wasn't reaching this section, so obviously no HTML either. Refresh. Now we have got the data. Now let's click on Load More and see what happens. Okay, so something did happen, but what is this? So we are getting H1 as well, then properties and a repetition of Load More button as well. Let's click. Okay, we are getting properties. And I think we are getting the repetition. Yeah, repetition of these ones. So urban loft to country manor, and again urban loft to country manor, urban loft to country manor, urban loft. Okay, so obviously our offset is not being updated. This is one problem. Let's fix this one first. It should get updated. Okay, so offset is changing. Let's go to index. Okay, so every time it's changing the offset back to 0, so we have to fix this problem. Okay, got it. So we can't set it to 0 because every time the index.php executes, it will change the offset back to 0. So what we need to do is that now we know that we are sending a query parameter through Fetch API. So we are going to check if it's set get through get global variable. We are going to check if we have this offset present. If that is the case, then set that value as the offset value. Now again, it's not necessary, but let's convert it into integer value. And if that is not the case, no offset parameter or index present in the get global variable, then set offset to 0. Okay, let's refresh. Click Load More. Okay, so still no change. Refresh. Okay, so the values are changing. This is urban loft but in Glasgow. However, this is urban house in Bristol. The last property is country manor, and over here it's modern house. However, what is wrong with the styling and why this get repeated? Even the H1 is being repeated. So what are we getting through render? What are we sending through render function? We are sending the property card. Let's explore the elements. So this is body, this is property container, again property container, even the metadata as well. Okay, so I think what is happening is this exit is not executing for some reason, and as a result we are ending up executing this whole document as well, which should not happen. Let's echo some text within Ajax and then exit and see what's happening. Refresh. Let's click on load. Okay, so this Ajax part is not executing. This one. So we are never entering over here. Let's comment this out. So is Ajax is a variable. We are setting if is set get offset. If this is, let's verify if this is the OFFSET index.php question mark. Okay, I have finally identified the problem. If you notice the spelling mistake, it's supposed to be requested REQUESTED requested, because let's save it. This is what we are checking against in the HTTP REQUESTED. So this one was not returning true. So this part was returning false. It was returning empty, and as a result, obviously this one was also not matching. So that was the problem. So let's refresh it. Click load more, and finally. Okay, so properties are different as well. Urban loft, and this is urban house, cozy house, beach house, luxury condo, cozy flat, and okay. So even IDs are different. Good. Seaside apartment. Okay, so finally we are done with the project. I think before we end the project, we should summarize the whole logic. So what is happening is that our index.php file is looking at whether the request has come from the URL address bar or by clicking on this load more page. So if it is coming from this URL, it doesn't have a custom header and it doesn't have a query string attached. When we are sending the request through this load more, we are again sending. So both of these requests are going to index.php file, but index.php file is able to identify where the request has come from. Is it an Ajax request, a normal HTTP request? It's a normal HTTP request if there is no custom header present, and neither is there the query parameter attached named offset. So if no custom header is present, it's sending the whole HTML document which displays the very first properties. However, if the response is coming through fetch request, then rather than sending the whole HTML document, it's just sending a portion of div which contains these cards. And those cards get appended on this page through DOM without refreshing the whole page. So this is the whole idea behind making this request, making this pagination dynamic and turning it into a single page application, because we are not reloading the page each time we are loading more pages. Rather, we are utilizing Ajax concepts. We are implementing those concepts through Fetch API, which is one of the APIs made available to us by default in the browser. So we are utilizing it, and through which we are making requests. And once we receive the data, we are appending it to the current page by DOM manipulation. I hope you did like this video. If you did, please do not forget to comment, like, subscribe, and share. And if you want to understand the very basic concept of pagination, you can check out my another video here. I'll put the link in the description down below as well. And if you are interested in the code, I will upload it on Buy Me a Coffee page as well, where you can buy me coffees, as many coffees as you like. I really love coffee. So happy coding.